A billion-dollar market didn't shrink. It disappeared overnight. And Washington is only now beginning to understand what that actually means, not just for the alcohol industry, but for the entire foundation of North American trade. I've been tracking this story closely, and what's unfolding between the United States and Canada right now goes so much deeper than a trade spat between neighbors. This isn't a story about wine and whiskey. This is a story about economic warfare being waged one empty shelf at a time. And the consequences are rippling far beyond anything the headlines are capturing. Here's how we got here. In early 2025, President Trump imposed a blanket 25% tariff on most Canadian imports. It was framed as leverage, a pressure tool designed to force concessions. Canada responded, but not the way most people expected, and not the way most trade disputes play out. Instead of simply matching tariff for tariff, Canada's provinces went straight for the shelves. They didn't raise prices on American products. They removed them entirely. And that distinction is everything. Ontario moved first, and it moved with real conviction. Premier Doug Ford had already telegraphed his intentions back in January 2025, warning publicly that if American tariffs became reality, American alcohol would disappear from LCBO stores. Politicians make threats like that all the time. Most of the time, nothing happens. This time, the moment those tariffs took effect, Ford followed through almost immediately. No delays, no negotiations, no gradual phase-in. The products were pulled. The scale of what happened is genuinely staggering. The LCBO, which is Ontario's government-controlled liquor retail system and one of the largest alcohol purchasers in the entire world, removed close to 1,000 individual products in a single sweeping action. Wines, beers, spirits, seltzers, sourced from 35 different American states, all gone from shelves practically overnight. British Columbia followed within days, pulling what officials publicly described as red state American alcohol brands from its own government-run stores. Shelves that had carried Jack Daniels, American bourbons, Californian wines, and craft beers from across the United States were suddenly empty, or replaced with signs explicitly telling Canadian consumers to buy Canadian products instead. A trade response had been transformed into a national consumer movement. And this did not stay contained to two provinces. As of today, bans on American spirits remain active across Ontario, Quebec, Manitoba, British Columbia, Atlantic Canada, and the territories. Think about what that means geographically and demographically. The majority of Canada's entire population now lives in regions where American alcohol is simply unavailable through official retail channels. Alberta and Saskatchewan have since lifted their restrictions, but the core of Canada's consumer market, its most populous, most economically significant provinces, remains closed to American producers. From Washington's perspective, this crossed a line that demanded a formal response. The U.S. Trade Representative's annual report released in late March 2026 didn't use diplomatic softening. It labeled these provincial liquor board restrictions as market access barriers that were significantly harming American exports, and it called directly for their removal as part of ongoing trade discussions. The language was pointed and deliberate. This was not being framed as a temporary retaliatory measure that would resolve itself. It was being framed as an unfair trade practice, a structural barrier that the United States intended to dismantle. U.S. Ambassador to Canada Pete Hoekstra amplified that message, publicly linking the alcohol ban alongside declining Canadian tourism to the United States as evidence of what he described as increasingly difficult relations between the two countries, going as far as repeating President Trump's characterization of Canada as mean and nasty to deal with. That kind of language from a sitting ambassador signals something important. It tells you that this dispute has moved well beyond the technical realm of tariff schedules and trade policy into the messier and more dangerous territory of political grievance. What has made this situation significantly more complex is that the alcohol ban has now been formally tied to the future of the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, CUSMA, the trade framework that governs commerce across the entire North American continent. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer listed the removal of these provincial restrictions as a condition for extending the deal. Let that sink in for a moment. What started as Doug Ford pulling Jack Daniels off LCBO shelves in Toronto has escalated into a negotiating condition attached to the most important trade agreement in North American history. Ontario has not flinched. Finance Minister Peter Bethlenfalvy has been unambiguous. American alcohol will not return to LCBO shelves until U.S. tariffs are completely and fully removed. Premier Ford has been even more direct, describing the ban openly as working, calling it an irritant that is getting Washington's attention. And then he made the strategy explicit. He said the solution is simple: remove the tariffs and the ban disappears. That's not a negotiating position dressed up in diplomatic language. That's a direct ultimatum, and so far, it's holding. But while the political standoff continues generating headlines, something far more consequential is happening quietly inside Canada's domestic alcohol market. And this is the part of the story that Washington's trade reports are not fully capturing, and that the political back and forth is almost entirely missing. The empty shelf space left behind by American brands has not stayed empty, not even close. Canadian producers have moved in, and they are not simply filling a gap. They are expanding, hiring, innovating, and in some cases fundamentally reshaping their businesses around the new reality. And the pace of that expansion is the kind of thing that should genuinely alarm American producers, because once supply chains are rebuilt, retail relationships are reestablished, and consumer habits are formed at this scale, reversing them becomes far more difficult than policymakers tend to assume. Maverick Distillery in Oakville, Ontario, is one of the clearest examples of this transformation. Founded in 2009 as Ontario's first licensed craft distillery, Maverick was already an established operation before any of this began. But since the ban took effect, their business has not grown incrementally. It has exploded. Vodka sales through the LCBO doubled. Whiskey sales increased by 300%. The company is now moving into a larger production facility, currently employs 25 people on the production side, and is actively hiring for additional roles. This is not a business riding a temporary wave. This is a business restructuring itself for a fundamentally different market. And their approach to product development reveals just how strategically Canadian producers are responding. Recognizing that bourbon was one of the most popular and recognizable American categories now absent from shelves, Maverick's team developed a hybrid product that blends Canadian whiskey with Kentucky bourbon already held in their existing warehouse inventory, producing a spirit that is bottled entirely in Oakville, carries Canadian identity, but delivers the richer bourbon-style flavor profile that consumers were missing. It is a product specifically engineered to capture customers who loved American bourbon and give them a reason not to go back when the ban eventually lifts. That is not gap filling. That is market capture. Across the country in Vancouver, Odd Society Spirits took a different but equally revealing approach, launching a strawberry gin crafted using fruit grown specifically in British Columbia's Fraser Valley. The product leans fully into the Buy Canadian sentiment, connecting the spirit directly to local agriculture, local identity, and local pride. What was once a marketing slogan has become a genuine purchasing philosophy for a significant portion of the Canadian consumer base, and producers are building products and brands around that philosophy as if it is permanent, because for them, planning as if it is permanent is the only rational strategy. The numbers coming out of Ontario confirm just how deep this shift has already become. The LCBO's own beverage trend report from December 2025 showed VQA wine sales, that's wines produced from Ontario-grown grapes, jumping by 58% in a single year. Overall sales of provincially produced alcohol increased by 20%. These are not the numbers of a temporary consumer reaction to empty shelves. These are the numbers of a structural market transformation that is still accelerating. Lawson Whiting, the CEO of Brown-Forman, the company behind Jack Daniel's, one of the most globally recognized American spirits brands, was remarkably candid about the impact. He stated publicly that Canada's shelf removal is worse than a tariff. His reasoning is worth understanding precisely because it cuts to the heart of why this situation is so serious for American producers. A 25% tariff raises your costs. It squeezes your margins. It may price some consumers out of your product, but you are still on the shelf. You still have visibility. You still have presence. A shelf ban eliminates all of that entirely. You are not competing at a disadvantage. You are not competing at all. And it is not just visibility that is being lost. It is the entire infrastructure of market access, distribution relationships that took years to build, retail positioning negotiated over decades. Consumer familiarity developed through sustained presence and marketing investment, all of it severed in a single government decision. And even a letter obtained through a Freedom of Information request showed that American alcohol suppliers were explicitly informed in writing that their access to one of North America's largest alcohol markets now depends directly on the removal of U.S. tariffs, and were even encouraged to communicate the financial impact to their own members of Congress. Private businesses were effectively being recruited as political messengers in a government-to-government dispute. And the stakes extend far beyond alcohol into industries that are foundational to Canada's entire economic structure. Canadian steel is facing a 50% U.S. tariff, disrupting export flows that once saw roughly half of all Canadian steel production and nearly 90% of Canadian aluminum shipped south of the border. Layoffs among the 23,000 workers in steel and 10,000 in aluminum are already being reported, translating policy decisions into real job losses at a pace that is difficult to reverse quickly even if trade conditions improve. The automotive sector carries even larger implications. In 2024, more than 90% of Canadian-made vehicles were exported to the United States. That extraordinary dependence on a single export market, a dependence built over decades under the assumption of stable and predictable trade access, now represents a profound vulnerability. Plant closures have already been announced in Brampton and Ingersoll. Shift reductions are underway in Oshawa. Investment is quietly being redirected toward production facilities inside the United States, where companies can manufacture without tariff exposure and operate within a more predictable regulatory environment. An industry that directly employs 125,000 Canadians and supports hundreds of thousands more through supply chains is restructuring itself in real time. And those structural changes, like the ones in the alcohol market, will not automatically reverse when and if a deal is eventually reached. The CUSMA review is scheduled for July 1st, 2026. That deadline is weeks away, and both sides are locked into positions that are structured as prerequisites rather than outcomes. The United States wants provincial alcohol bans lifted before any agreement moves forward. Canadian provinces have made it equally clear that bans will remain until tariffs are removed. Neither side has an immediate incentive to move first. And every week that passes without resolution is another week in which Canadian producers expand capacity, American brands lose consumer familiarity, and the market architecture that American companies spent decades building inside Canada quietly continues to erode. The deeper question that none of the official reports are asking directly is this: even if a deal is eventually struck, even if tariffs are removed and bans are lifted and politicians hold a press conference declaring victory, does the old market relationship actually still exist on the other side? Because the evidence building across Canada's alcohol industry, its steel sector, and its automotive manufacturing base suggests that the answer may increasingly be no. Markets that are disrupted at this scale and for this duration don't simply reset. Consumers who have found alternatives don't automatically return. Producers who have invested in expansion don't scale back. Supply chains that have been rebuilt don't revert. What Canada has demonstrated, deliberately or not, is that a government with control over its own retail infrastructure can effectively remove a trading partner's products from its market, replace them with domestic alternatives at a speed and scale that defies conventional trade theory, and in doing so, permanently shift the competitive landscape in ways that persist long after the political dispute that triggered them is resolved. That is a lesson that goes far beyond Jack Daniels and LCBO shelves. It is a preview of what economic conflict looks like in an era where governments are willing to use market access itself as a weapon. And it raises a question that neither Washington nor Ottawa has fully answered yet. In a world where trade can be turned off like a switch, what does open trade actually mean anymore? The July deadline is coming. The next few months will tell us whether North American trade looks like what it did 5 years ago, or something none of us fully anticipated. Stay with me on this story, because the developments ahead are going to move fast, and the implications are going to reach far beyond anything currently in the headlines. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. This is exactly the kind of story we dig into every single week.